So welcome to this Research in Practice event held on the 4th of August 2021. I'm Jacqueline Baker, your host. Today's speaker is Marianne Jackson, who is joining us from Visionary Design Development. Marianne was born in and grew up in country Queensland on a pig farm and went to school in a very small town with a population of only around 100 people. Marianne studied a Bachelor of Applied Science in the Built Environment at QIT, which is now QUT, her first entry into interdisciplinary education. This course was actually a feeder course into more specialist studies in building, landscaping, planning, architecture, and quantity surveying. So armed with her first degree, Marianne went to Perth to go to uni to WAIT, Western Australian Institute of Technology, which is now called Curtin. She graduated into the recession and held various roles unrelated to architecture, and then got into public service and found herself working in the family law court. Then at the end of 85, she moved to Melbourne and started working in small architectural firms, registering at the age of 28. Then she began her own business in, I believe, 1996 with her late husband, and that business is now 25 years old. Marianne's practice focuses on small-scale residential and also institutional architecture. After some time, through an opportunity with Archicentre, Marianne began to focus her work on accessibility challenges for Victorian bathrooms for the over 60s. Some of the key questions that shape her work are: how does one design accessible features into existing housing stock? And how does one get the system to take financial responsibility? Marianne is also a PhD candidate at Swinburne University of Technology, working from the Centre of Social Impact. In 2013, Marianne set up a volunteer studio, which is called VDD Studio. This focuses on competitions, public consultation, pro bono and training programs for accessibility. Now, the title of Marianne's presentation is Victoria's Existing Bathrooms, Facilitating Lifetimes of Living. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Marianne, and after the presentation, there'll be an opportunity to ask Marianne some questions and have a great discussion. Over to you.
Okay, all right then. The first thing I need to do is to share my screen because I've got a presentation. So hopefully that will work. But Sonia's in the room for me so I can get assistance. But I think it's that one. Yep. So share. Okay, so people can see the screen, the presentation? Yep. Okay, all right. So as Jacqueline has said, the presentation's about bathrooms. But firstly, I want to thank Jacqueline for being the convener of this research group, because I think it's absolutely fabulous that such a thing exists. As you can see down the bottom, there's a few people involved in this particular work. Sonia's in the room with me here at the office. Andrew Martell was going to join today. I'm not sure whether he's in the room as yet, but hopefully he will be later. But this is research in progress, and so it's not meant to be a presentation of our finished work. We found this out. It's still exploring where we're going to go with this research that we're doing for this particular project. So yes, as I said, basically we're trying to investigate whether Victoria's existing bathrooms are compatible with lifetimes of living. Enough about me, really. But although Jacqueline said I'm very busy in the invite, I prefer to think of myself as semi-retired, really, but rather that my main role is leadership and mentorship and trying to get the current generation as skilled up in built environment accessibility as much as possible, And invariably, I find that enthusiasm levels amongst the young graduates and students is very high for that. So that's very rewarding. Visionary design development came about when my late husband, Ralph Green, and I merged our optometry practice, his optometry practice, and my architecture practice, which is a bit odd, perhaps. But subsequently, Ralph had studied international development and I had studied planning. So planning and international development more obviously linked than architecture and optometry. But in Ralph's international development, he focused on Latin American and disability studies. And in somewhat of a twist of being careful what you wish for, Ralph became terminally ill and progressed through needing various mobility aids. And so, yes, I have both professional and personal experience of disability. So that was, it's been an interesting journey. As Jacqueline said in the introduction, we've also got a volunteer-driven in-house research unit called VDD Studio. And that came about because a few years ago, I identified that there was a disconnect between university and what's happening in practice, and more specifically with the area of work that we're trying to work in, trying to skill up students and graduates in built environment accessibility is a very necessary thing, we believe. So we are committed to research, but we particularly want to progress to practice or praxis improvement. So we don't want to just stop at this is what is happening, this is why that's so. We actually want to make the world a better place. So we're hopefully working towards that. And we're also committed to accessible presentations, but we haven't got very far with that really, because it's really opening up a whole new ball game. You know, where does the built environment as a physical thing and technology, where do these things stop and start? They're entirely connected now. And how much of the built environment communication is done through graphics? How can we work towards plain language graphics? So, you know, we acknowledge that this presentation is not accessible. It is primarily aimed at a built environment audience, and therefore we haven't got any alt text happening. We haven't got any Auslan translation happening. We have a preference for using Google Meets as a meeting platform because it's got inbuilt captioning. Although Zoom and Teams, I think, have got some degree of captioning happening, but I don't think it's actually automatic or free. I think you have to do something to avail yourself of the captions. Anyway, as I said, Visionary Design Development is very committed to research, and so what we're presenting today is some of the work that we've been working on. We also acknowledge country, so we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And just a note on that, as you can imagine, the disability status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is much worse than the general population in Australia. So we're also very cognizant of that situation. Now, on to the more important bits. Research in progress being presented today has arisen out of the project funded by the Melbourne Disability Institute, the MDI, and they're a research institute that was established by Melbourne University to build a collaborative research program improve the lives of people with disability. And so accessing the home, collecting and analysing the reports from 17 years of Victoria's home renovation service was the project that the Melbourne Disability Institute funded and that this presentation is about. So from 1999 to 2016, DHHS in Victoria funded the home renovation service. The scheme was administered and run by Archi Centre, which many of you would know was owned by the Institute of Architects. For eligible clients, the scheme provided an architect and an occupational therapist, although not every home visit included an occupational therapist, but to visit a client's home and conduct an assessment focusing on access and safety. And a report was generated for both the existing and proposed conditions. And each inspection included architectural drawings of bathrooms or ramps, for example, and approximate costings. This scheme was stopped in 2016 and it has not been replaced. And that we feel is a major problem. So accessing the home, the research project funded by the MDI, collecting and analysing the reports. We collected 14,686 reports, and that included approximately 11,500 digital reports and almost 3,000 hard copy reports. And interviews have been conducted with 13 of the architects involved. 20 architects, or approximately 20 architects, responded to our call out for collecting of these reports, because in total there would have been approximately 40,000 reports altogether across the 20 years, but we were able to collect 14,500 of them. So we needed to be standardized. They needed to be standardized and cleaned before being ready for inclusion in a database, which would allow searches to be made on specific criteria. Inclusion of the numerical data and the images together in a database is a complex undertaking. And due to all of the complexities, we did not get as far with databasing the reports. We didn't get as far as we had hoped that we would in the year that we spent on this. But we have got them collated into a systemised directory, and we have been able to do further investigation via a purposive sample. We've basically identified 4 architects, and we've taken their last 50 reports. And those 4 architects, I'll explain more about them a little bit later in the presentation, but for the last couple of years, we've been looking at 200 reports as a sample to see what we find out of those reports. So as you can see, the state of the hard copy reports was interesting. We had faxed reports that you could barely read. We had reports in lever arch folders, and Sonia's in the room with me and she's nodding because she had to take all of these things out of the lever arch folders, unstaple them, scan them, rename them. So she spent a lot of time standing at the photocopier. But we have a fabulous resource out of all of this, and we think we could probably work on it for years to come. So we, as I said earlier, we have a total of about 14,500 reports, about 3,000 hard copy ones, and about 11,500 digital ones. And as previously mentioned in the last slide, we also interviewed a number of the architects, and Andrew Martell from Melbourne Uni, who we've worked with on this project, he's identified various emergent themes from these interviews. And many of these themes that emerged out of our interviews with the architects are around the current system, shortcomings with the current system, because many of the Archi-Centre architects that were involved in the home renovation services have pivoted to being NDIS providers, home modification consultants. And so they're working very closely with occupational therapists in the NDIS system. They're very au fait with the current NDIS system. And as you can see, they're picking up that the NDIS system is being criticised for inadequate cost and timelines, but that in general, the architects enjoyed and valued the contribution of the occupational therapists, because this is a collaborative undertaking with the user of the space, the occupational therapist, who's much more aware of the functional capacity of the user of the space, and then ourselves as architects being more switched on to the construction issues. And also what access consultants, architects that are working in the NDIS system are finding now, that much more construction detail needs to be included in NDIS work compared to this original home renovation service, because they are two different sorts of things. But it's the amount of time that's required to actually satisfactorily complete an exemplary home modification through the NDIS system is not to be underestimated. And that kind of feeds into what I want to say a little bit later about complex adaptive systems. So starting to think about this work as research and a paper to be published in an appropriate leading peer-reviewed journal, we've done some work on context analysis. Next few slides are indicative of literature review content. So more specifically, moving on to Victoria's bathrooms, thinking about the background, the system in which all of this stuff is happening. Thinking about the world view, inaccessible, affordable, visitable. And Andrew is much more familiar with home modification schemes in other countries and has interviewed several people overseas, back in the day when travel was a thing. But at the moment, we have identified, for instance, that in Great Britain in 2014, only 16% of councils could provide any data on the number of homes in their area that were wheelchair accessible. In Massachusetts, dwelling owners are required by law to make information about their accessible properties public, but in itself, that doesn't tell us what proportion of housing is actually accessible. In 2013, in Canada, less than 5% of British Columbia's housing registry's affordable housing stock. Less than 5% of that was affordable housing stock. And so affordability is also linked into this issue, because as a generalisation, disability and disadvantage are linked. Statistically, people with disability earn less, less educated, et cetera, so that their income is generally, as a generalisation again, is generally less. And so we also need to think about affordable solutions. How can we actually make sure that whatever modifications we're putting forward are both future-proofing and affordable? And of course, some or most of this information is not up to date, and the ramification of the pandemic on the whole disability arena is still being played out. thinking about Australia, there are approximately 2.37 million households in Victoria, but only 86,000 social housing properties exist. There doesn't seem to be much empirical housing livable or accessibility data, qualitative or quantitative, doesn't seem to be readily available. Home modifications not promoted within the rural healthcare system. Rural home modification in Australia has been largely neglected as an area of research. And yes, being from a country family myself, I appreciate that most of Australia does not live in the country, but the challenges that people living in the country do face are very real. And so it is a problem that a lot of the regional housing stock is not very well researched. It's not very well understood what's actually out there. Caroma did a livable bathrooms for older people project, and they uncovered that respondents experienced significant issues with the accessibility and usability of existing bathrooms in Australia. And with my access consultant hat on and with my NDIS hat on, that's certainly no surprise to me, unfortunately. So thinking about the problem from different perspectives, thinking about it from the perspective of rights, for example, so that, the UNCRPD, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, that was adopted by the UN in 2006. It's been ratified. Australia is a signatory to that convention. It's been ratified, and the optional protocol also. But the various components of the UNCRPD have not actually been formally written into Australia's legislation. And so even though the UNCRPD says things like that housing should be accessible, it's not followed through into the Australian regulations and legislative system. So my PhD work, which is around holistically assessing built environment accessibility at neighbourhood scale, has opened my eyes to complex adaptive systems. There's plenty of research and resources to look up, so I encourage those of you that are interested in such a thing to explore that further. But I sometimes say, though, that I should stop finding complex adaptive systems under every rock and around every corner. But it does help to think about the modern world as adaptive subsystems constantly in play. So thinking about people with disability and housing, housing tenure is an issue for many people with disability. Poor housing quality is obviously an issue for many people with disability. Existing housing is being modified to redress livability and accessibility shortcomings. Modifications are happening around Australia, but as the Caroma project found, there are many barriers to undertaking home modifications. And in Australia in 2016, over a third of people with disability did not own the housing they live in. And yes, housing ownership across Australia is reducing, but the rate of people with disability home ownership is also decreasing quicker than the general population. And as we know, in Australia in general, trying to make modifications to a house you don't live in, that you don't own, is problematic. The NDIS is a wonderful thing, and when that was introduced, there's been an element of the NDIS will fix it, but home modifications are only a small component of the overall scheme. Over 65s are not eligible for the NDIS. And we know from research that the incidence of disability increases with age. And so once, 60, 70, 80, the incidence of disability within 80-year-old percentile is like 1 in 2. And life expectancy of Australians is increasing. And so what are we going to do about that disjuncture between what might be available to NDIS participants, home modifications that might be available to NDIS participants, and people that aren't? Because overall, the NDIS participants is going to be capped at about 650,000 or something like that. And in overall terms, there's something like 4.4 million people with disability in Australia. So thinking about the full spectrum, not just wheelchair accessibility. So, many people won't require at any point in time, most people don't require wheelchair access. And so some changes can easily be made. How do we go about incorporating those changes into the system? So, okay, enough of literature review. So our preliminary investigations into typical existing bathrooms, and I know that you can't see what you're looking at the moment. What we've done is, as I alluded to earlier, we're working with the last 50 reports of 4 architects that we sampled out. And the 4 architects, we selected them on the basis of one's in regional Victoria, the other 3 are in metropolitan Melbourne, one's in western suburbs generally, one's in southeastern suburbs generally, and one's in kind of northeastern suburbs. And so we're trying to identify what the common typical existing bathroom features are. And then as we move forward, we're going to try and start identifying whether there's any real differences between regional and metropolitan, between western suburbs and eastern suburbs, et cetera, et cetera. But at the moment, we've applied various testing filters to figure out what might a typical bathroom look like in actual spatial arrangement. And so if I zoom in here, you'll start seeing what I mean. So for instance, we've gone, okay, what are the shape of bathrooms? So for instance, in this particular architect, we've identified that the most common shape is rectangular. We've thought about how big are these bathrooms in square meters. Again, for instance, in this particular architect, the most common is they're about 4 square meters. Another filter that we've applied is small, medium, and large. And this has been taken from a previous round of work that we conducted on these 200 initial reports, where small, medium, and large is not so much connected to the actual size, but from an accessibility perspective. And so small is in terms of it's not very accessible to move around at all in that small space. Whereas large is from an accessibility perspective. So at face value, making changes to a larger space should achieve more accessibility than you'll be able to achieve than to making changes to a small space. We've thought about, okay, they might be mostly rectangular, but what are the dimensions? 1 point something meters by 2 point something meters in this particular instance. We've thought about how old are these houses? And the reason for selecting these various filters is thinking about accessibility and impact on making changes. And a house, houses that are 50 to 75 years old are likely to have certain other characteristics as well that will play into the ease of which they can be modified. Then we've also started thinking about what are the existing conditions within these bathrooms, and all of them have basins, obviously, but is there basin, toilet, shower? Is there basin, bath with shower over the bath? Is there basin, bath and a shower in a cubicle, et cetera, et cetera? And then we've also started thinking about their performance against the livable housing design guidelines, for instance. And so we're working our way through all of these ones. If I go back to page view, then I go on to the next one. And as you can see, again, rectangular. But for instance, this particular architect who's in the east as opposed to the west of Melbourne, the most common bathroom size was 5 square metres. But still, from an accessibility perspective, most were still small. Again, thinking about dimensions, thinking about house ages, et cetera, et cetera. And so if I go back to here again, yeah. So we're working through this first one that I showed you. Oops. Whoops, sorry. So the first one, western suburbs, this other one on the other side of Melbourne. And yes, they are displaying slightly different characteristics. But what we're doing on this side of the diagram is we're trying to figure out that if we arrange them by shape, sorry, I'm pointing at the computer, obviously. If we arrange them by shape, if we arrange them by area, if we arrange them by size, et cetera, can we come up with 1, 2, 3 bathrooms that are most representative of these bathrooms? We're still working on that aspect of it. Again, the same sort of thing. We're working through the shape, area, size, dimensions, etc. Then again, trying to figure out whether, this one, these lines down the page, indicate that this one, for instance, shape, area, size, dimension, house age, is a very common bathroom amongst this group. So we're working through them. We've also started to think about this information statistically, and we've identified, for instance, that although the most common, sorry, I'll go back to where I was. In terms of fixtures within a bathroom, although overall basin, toilet, shower, cubicle within a bathroom is the most common common set of fixtures in these bathrooms. In fact, no toilet in the room is more common. And so we need to work through all of this information to figure out that the differences between the supposedly most typical or representative and the likelihood of you actually coming across that. So there's a lot of work in figuring that out that we haven't got to as yet. And we're also wanting to investigate and tabulate things like whether there's a concrete or a timber floor, because the significance of those features, for instance, concrete floor will be on ground almost certainly. So that means that achieving accessibility to the house is probably easier. A timber floor means that making modifications, changing plumbing locations and things like that are likely to be easier, but access to the house from the street is likely to be difficult because a timber floor will be raised. And so these are the kind of accessibility ramifications that these kind of characteristics tell us. We want to figure out what the door widths are, what the adjacent hall widths are, what the window locations are, performance against livable housing design guidelines, etc. Because once we move from the bathroom itself, thinking about what's in there, we also need to think about getting into it, because having a fabulously accessible bathroom is not much use if you can't actually move from the hallway through the door into the bathroom. And so it just gets messier and messier. So we know what the problem is. We know that there are inaccessible existing bathrooms. We know what the technical solution is, make them accessible. And, there's enough guidelines, enough guidance around and enough expertise around to be able to achieve that from a technical perspective. But how do we get there? How do we go from inaccessible existing bathrooms to accessible bathrooms in existing housing that are livable for lifetimes, ongoing into the future? So we're starting to think about, solution conjectures. Is the route to accessible bathrooms in existing housing through government? How do you connect with government? I was in a seminar last week and the presenter put forward, which I thought was absolutely amazing, and I've co-opted it, co-design plus audacity. But you also need to figure out what the levers of change are. You need to understand the systems. You need to understand budget cycle, legislative cycle, election cycle, political priorities, etc., etc. And it's unlikely that the government is going to stomp up the cash to make the existing housing throughout Australia accessible, because we know, with working on our NDIS work, that modifying existing houses' bathrooms is 20 to 30 to 40,000. So I think that the solution through government is not the complete way to go. Maybe we should educate built environment designers. But, like architects, building designers, interior designers, at university level, TAFE level, but who exactly designs most housing? And who exactly is involved in home modifications design? Is the answer through policy and legislation? But if you start thinking about that as the solution, then you have to factor in the fact that not all of the states of Australia have committed to the very modest accessible housing requirements that are coming into the 2022 version of the NCC, the BCA. So is that the solution? Not totally. Do we need to start working through some theory of change processes? I think this is getting more towards where we need to get to. And the conclusion, there should be a great big question mark on that at the moment, because the only conclusion that I've come to so far is we need to interrogate complex adaptive systems to really understand what's going on out there, so we can figure out, where to push here, where to pull here, and that it needs to have a multi-perspective view at all times, because there's no linear solution. And that's basically where I've got to. So questions and discussions, please.
Thanks, Marianne. That was a really comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much. Does anyone have a question first up?
Jacqueline, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, fantastic presentation, Marianne. I really like the way you've acknowledging the complexity and the interplay between lots of complex systems, that this kind of problem is not solved in isolation at all. And it's actually a mix of not just, it's not just design, it's also, it's also commerce, it's also planning, it's also a lot of, there's a lot of bureaucracy around it as well, and community and things like that. I've got two questions, I guess. One is, have you considered the role that, I guess, more current and emerging technologies would play in assisting with understanding the complex systems and the impacts that those complex systems have in kind of like a bi-directional or feedback loop kind of way? I'm kind of thinking more about my field, which is computational design and kind of the world of, I guess, big data, and kind of bringing those together and kind of, I guess, cybernetics in a way. So kind of augmenting that design process, because I feel like, there's a lot of work that is obviously gone into doing a lot of analysis and a lot of review, but there's also a lot of manual work and a lot of managing of very complicated things in the human mind, whereas computational techniques can assist in managing that and often uncovering things that you might not, or a human mind is sometimes unable to properly or cognitively kind of understand. And I guess the second thing is, that data set is fantastic. Is that available anywhere?
The answer to your last question is no, not yet. That was the original intention when we embarked on the whole project, that yes, we get all these reports from all these architects, we'd get them into some kind of system, we'd turn them into some kind of database, and then voila, it would be available. We just have not got that far at all because, of the state of the existing files. Even though it was a standardized service, the service changed about 4 times over the length of the 20 years, and also different architects, God love us, even though we're meant to be standardized, we do things in different ways.
Everyone's got a different standard.
we just haven't got that far.
Yeah, okay.
And although we were funded for a year to do that initial work, the work that we've done since then has been totally volunteer driven. So we're only kind of working on it as we can. We've recently been able to acquire more volunteers, so we're very grateful to those people. And going back to what you started with, I have no idea what you're talking about, but it sounds fabulous. And yes, we want to get in on it. The only caveat that I do have in that regard is that I don't know whether you're familiar with the idea of models of disability. The institutional model of disability from a built environment perspective is very much, we don't have to worry about them, they're put away in institutions. The medical model of disability, we don't have to worry about them, they'll be fixed, cured, etc. The social model of disability starts recognising that disability, that the built environment is a disabling instrument in itself. And the human rights model of disability is starting to recognise that people have rights and that duty bearers, and in our instance, that means built environment practitioners, we need to be accountable for our actions. But I'm a little concerned about the possibility of a technology model of disability developing, whereby we all go, technology will fix it. And so, yes, bring on whatever tools we can use to help this investigation along. But let's not let that obscure the view that we're actually talking about people that are having a lot of difficulty using their housing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd love to chat more with you about this after this, because I think there's a lot of it's just a really fascinating space, and there's a need for much more I guess human-centered and empathetic applications of technology in the built environment, because we have, from my perspective, particularly in the commercial practice world, but certainly in the developer world, we have pushed ourselves into a corner where we are driven purely by mostly financial and efficiency returns, which does deny basically the human experience a lot of the time. It removes it from that equation. So no, that really fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Well, you must thank Iliana for the actual look of the presentation, because yes, Iliana is actually doing a PhD as well. She's an interior architecture graduate, but she's also got a Cert 4 in disability and a family member with autism and a non-verbal communicator. And so, yes, we've got this disability architecture intersection happening as much as we possibly can, really.
Amazing.
Marianne, I was wondering, what database have you used to put all of this complex data into? I just can't imagine one. So
there's no database yet.
Okay.
We've got stuff, on paper and in the computer. At the moment, what Peng's done is just working from, graphically extracting those diagrams from the files and putting them in ArchiCAD, Revit, whatever he's using, and just then playing with those. As you saw, my handwritten table is just me thinking on a piece of paper. We had visions early on that we were going to put the whole thing in FileMaker Pro if we could, because the good thing about FileMaker is that you can construct a report, a form that is very usable. But we haven't got that far either, because once you start thinking about how you're going to construct the form or the record, whatever you want to call it, is it appropriate at the moment to preemptively drop off some of the information, the rich information out of these reports, or not? And we've kind of gone, no, we don't actually want to lose much of the information of these reports just yet. But we also think you can't actually put everything from the reports in one form. And so we do need to start making decisions about how we're going to group things, how we're going to filter things, so that we can run queries, useful queries at later dates. So, yeah, I mean, in lots of ways, we haven't got past the, oh my God, this is fabulous information.
If you haven't yet, you might be worth looking at a platform called Airtable, which
People have been talking about Airtable lately.
It's really good. Because it's adaptable, and that question of what's in the form versus what's in the database and having to make the decision. Airtable is really dynamic in that you can actually have forms that can inform subsets of your database, and you can update that dynamically over time. So you're not having to make necessarily a decision about one or the other at the beginning.
Yeah.
I'd definitely recommend. I've had a great, really good kind of experience using this for as a database tool.
Yeah, excellent. Jacqueline, you've done an amazing job assembling these people.
Oh, they're only the best.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Are there any other questions for Marianne?
I had a quick question, which is sort of less researchy and more professional, or personal rather. We have I don't know if you've heard of Wendy Lovelace.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. Oh, you know Wendy. She's kind of putting forward this idea at the moment that so we have, like, you know, disability requirements for public buildings that all need to be accessible, and she's pushing for all private buildings as well, new private residences, to be accessible. And I was wondering how you felt about that and what the like the practicalities of actually making that happen are, because in Brisbane at the moment, a lot of architecturally designed homes have a lot of steps in them, to the point where, like, one architecture firm kind of was joking that they couldn't ever have their mother come and visit because there were just so many steps in the house. And I was just kind of astounded by that. And then I was really interested to hear Wendy's ideas about what our legislation could look like in the future. And I was wondering how you felt about it.
Well, I know some of the work that we've done in the past is, for instance, flooding, building back better. The knee-jerk reaction to rebuilding after flooding is generally build it higher. But of course, you give yourself a bigger accessibility problem. And I'm originally from Queensland. And so, yes, I do understand that there's a lot of steps in the Queensland buildings, in housing, and the idea of the Queenslander, etc. So I don't have an answer other than it needs more dialogue amongst more people, because our interactions with people with disability are generally, the conclusion is that nobody wants anything residential to look like a hospital.
Yeah.
But it's pointless if it's not usable.
Yeah, it's so important. I thought that statistic that you said, that 36% of people with disability don't own the house they live in. That's huge, and that's such a massive issue for the housing stock and the rental market in Australia, something that we really need to deal with. So do you think then that, because I teach a subject for second year architecture students where we touch on this topic. It's sort of a very broad topic, but it's a really interesting question that I'd like to pose to them next year as well, is this kind of how do you balance this? And maybe, as you said, it's just about getting them aware of it so that it's in the back of their mind, and then they make just slightly better choices, make it easier to renovate, for example, make it easier to have that turning circle in the hallway outside the bathroom door entry, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And, the cost of residential lifts are coming down. And if you design in such a way that you can retrofit a lift in easily by, if you have some kind of staircase that you can put the lift down in later, or you've got, a series of storage cupboards that you can put a lift in later. So there's ways of thinking about addressing accessibility. And Sonia's just written on the whiteboard here for me that you need balance, but you must put human rights first. That's our opinion, obviously, but that's what we're very conscious of.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's really interesting.
No problem.
Yeah, Marianne, I can't help thinking this would make a really awesome PhD for someone to work out, because I can appreciate the complexity, and I can see why you only selected, or did you say 50?
Yeah, so we've, of our 14,500 that we've got, we've been working on this sample of 200 reports, and those 200 reports come from 4 architects. Their last 50 reports that they did And as I said, they were regional and metropolitan Melbourne. And for this particular project, we've just pulled the bathrooms out of them because the reports were generally for either, front entry ramps, or bathrooms. So yeah, we're just
but wouldn't it be amazing if you could actually include them all, and then through some, like, get some assistance, obviously, of a PhD or something like that, and then get some data cleaning happening that would exclude the ones that wouldn't fit the research questions that you might ask.
Yeah,
I don't know. I probably wouldn't have minded something like this for my PhD. I think it could be packaged up quite nicely. Have you thought of that?
Well, I'm a practitioner. Yes, I have some qualifications, and yes, I'm doing a PhD, but I'm firmly located in the private sector. It would be very good if we could form some serious partnerships with universities that wanted to somehow pursue this through PhD work. That would be awesome. And Andrew, who we've been working with at Melbourne Uni, he's obviously got various things to do already, and he's a teaching academic. So he's a bit stretched.
Okay, are there any more questions? I've just realised it's 1 o'clock and people probably have some other meetings to run off to. Okay, well, thank you very much, Marianne. We really appreciate you coming in to present to us today, and all the best. And it sounds like Tristan and Morgan will be in touch, maybe have further that discussion. And next month, Carly will be presenting. So we look forward to that, and we'll see you all then.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
See you later.
Okay.
Bye-bye.